Hello, everybody. This is the CUDAN Open Lab Seminar, Cultural Data Analytics, on Monday, March 1. And today we're very happy to have Ruth Ahnert from the Turing Institute and Queen Mary University of London speaking about big data, orders of magnitude in digital humanities projects. And I think Ruth will talk about her trajectory. So I don't give you any more introduction. I can assure you it will be awesome. So the stage is yours.
Thanks so much, Max. And thanks for inviting me. It's always nice to get an invitation to speak about my work. So I'm going to be sharing today work from 4 different projects I've worked on over the last few years, all of which are collaborative. And so I always like to begin by crediting all the people who I am reliant on. And my keyboard's not working again. There we go. So these are some of my collaborators, past and present, who I've worked with on epistolary networks, so communications networks, including the projects Tudor Networks of Power and Networking Archives. And they're all really wonderful people. And also this is the very large team I work with on Living with Machines at the Alan Turing Institute, and on which I've been working on the last couple of years. So the 4 projects I'm going to be talking about chart my very own journey into work in the digital humanities, and perhaps not accidentally, each has been larger and more ambitious than the one before. Each of these projects present a different set of problems related to the scale and origin of the data, which are, I hope, instructive for scholars working in digital or computational humanities. Through them, I'm going to discuss the benefits of things like hand-curated data, the problems of working with large data sets created by digitization projects with imposed data structures, inadequate data cleaning, the challenges of aggregating and linking data sets at scale. With ever larger data sets, we are presented with increased potential, and that potential can be harnessed by computational tools to render these archives navigable. But there are also a set of trade-offs that digital humanists need to make when adopting these, and these trade-offs become greater at each scale of the projects I'm going to talk about today. So, my work in this area began with what is a really very small data set, one that I had begun working on during my very non-digital PhD on prison writing. They were a collection of letters associated with a very specific set of religious martyrs from the 16th century executed during the reign of Mary I. And so my first ever collaborator and also my husband, Sebastian, had got a visiting fellowship at a network science lab in the US where he met Max. And I started reading up on network science. And I had the idea that I could use letters to reconstruct communication networks and analyzing them using some of the computational methods I was learning about. However, at this stage, the letters were not a data set. The versions were, the ones we wanted to work with were mostly held in 2 libraries, Emmanuel College Library in Cambridge and the British Library, but they had not been digitized, and Emmanuel College Library wouldn't even let me photograph them for my own use. So I had to create this data set from scratch by reading each letter in the original 16th century handwriting and recording the data I needed, the senders, recipients, the date and place of writing, as well as all the relationships described within the letters. And the analysis of these letters was published in ELH in 2015. You can see the reference at the bottom of the screen. And it allowed us to understand how the community managed during a period of acute religious persecution and how it evolved as key leaders were executed. And you can see the impact of the execution of one of those leaders in the slide here, when John Bradford was burnt at the stake. Now, the success of this first collaboration led to a second, much bigger collaboration funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is called Tudor Networks of Power. And I undertook this project with Sebastian from 2015 to 2018. And the data we're working with there is the State Papers Archive, which had been digitized by a company called Gale, who created a resource called State Papers Online. And we were interested in a specific subset of the data they're digitized. So we were interested in the Tudor reigns from the accession of Henry VIII in 1509 to the death of Elizabeth I in 1603. And we were specifically interested in the letters. So they provided us with the underlying XML and the images of the manuscript. And we were able to get those because Sebastian's library subscribed. It's really expensive. It's £40,000 a year. So what we got was, we extracted from the XML anything that we thought was a letter, because it had a sender and a recipient field. And we got just over 130,000 letters. And we extracted from that, after cleaning, which I'll talk about in a moment, just over 20,000 people with geographical locations over 6,000 sites, which were across England, Europe, but also into sort of South America, India, and some outlier locations. And the work from that has a number of sort of outputs. We are working on a book. We've published an article. We're going to show a visualization in a minute. But we also want to make available with the book the associated data set and code. So I think it's worth thinking about at this point the difference between our first project and this one, and how the data compares. The kind of data set I created for that first small Protestant project was circumscribed by what it was possible for me as a single person to do in an archive without any project funding. So it's a small data set. By comparison, extracted data can be much larger because it's leveraging the labor of many others and their funding. However, there are drawbacks to that. When creating your own data, you can collect the fields that you need. However, when you're reliant on others, you're reliant on their particular data structures. And it can also require much more in-depth cleaning. Not always, but it can. So for the Protestant project, I could ensure that all the people and places were denoted by a standard identifier. By comparison, the data we extracted from State Papers Online, the XML was very dirty. Its metadata fields were simply pulled from 19th century catalogues. And so single people were denoted by multiple different names due to title changes, abbreviations, spelling variants, marriage, or inability to identify the two people were the same person. And the same label could refer to multiple people, such as the Archbishop of Canterbury, could be multiple people during that period. As a result, we needed to clean 38,000 name labels, which became 20,000 people, and 8,000 place labels, which became about 6,000. We also added linked data, the people where it was accessible, where it was possible, and geocoded identifiable places. And so I spent about 9 months working on the people. Two amazing colleagues, Josie Cree and Lotta Fickers, spent 4 months disambiguating and deduplicating place names and geocoding them. And the length of time we took there was a decision we took because we're publishing for a primarily historical audience. So for historians who have certain levels of anxiety about the accuracy of data, we decided to take an assisted manual approach. So we developed tools which would allow us to go in and manually check the kinds of decisions that we were making. And that process is talked a little bit more in the chapter that's at the bottom of that slide. So once this data was cleaned, though, we could harness it for all sorts of purposes. So one of the things we undertook with our collaborator, Kim Albrecht, which you can see in this slide, was an interactive visualization of all of the communications network that we could reconstruct. So we've got the macro view of the entire body of people. We've got an individual person view where we can look at the correspondence of that person over time or over space. And what that project has in common with the analysis of the Protestant letters is, despite the huge difference in size, is the defined nature of the collection. They are, the first one was defined because of how they were collected and published for religious posterity. And the second one was more pragmatically an archive defined by a data set that got given to us. But the visualization also gives us a great way of scoping what is possible with data sets like this. So the spatial view allows us to see what happens if you connect the place data of a given person's correspondence, as well as seeing where they receive letters from. So we can stitch together fragments of a person's itinerary. And so the red lines we've got in this image here are the movements of Erasmus as derived from the places of writing letters. By combining all these separate itineraries for all of the people in our data set, we can start to capture the places and times at which these itineraries intersect. So let's consider two individuals in this data set who wrote letters from different locations on subsequent dates. We can thus construct two itineraries. So in this case, the itineraries intersected on April the 22nd. So this shows us all sorts of ways we can use this method. If our interest is in adding links to our network that aren't otherwise evidenced by letters, then one way we could use this information is to look for intersections between people who don't otherwise correspond, and then maybe search the contents of their letters for mentions of one another, and that's a method we've used. We can also see if people wrote to one another before they intersected or after they intersected, to see if a meeting might have brought about a written correspondence. We can also calculate a statistical estimate of the likelihood that two people were in the same place by chance. So if two people are in London in the same year, that's not probably that interesting. But if they're in a small Welsh village on the same day, then that might be statistically interesting. And this allows us to focus on what might be important intersections that might have not been noticed before. So what we noticed in the trends of the ranked list of potentially significant intersections were wars and sieges, and the visitations associated with something called the dissolution of monasteries in England, when Henry dismantled religious houses. Another area of our work on this data is focused on the ability of combinations of network metrics to reveal particular categories of people and how they communicated. So our method evolved from an observation about one auto-generated graph, and that the graph is here. I remember where I was sitting when I was looking at it. So part of the tooling we developed for this project, we had a facility to sort of auto-generate graphs, so you could look at two metrics together and sort of start to see the patterns. And so what we're seeing here is who was writing in the 1580s, and what we're charting as the betweenness centrality ranking on the y-axis against the total degree on the x-axis. And for those of you who aren't familiar with those metrics, the degree is basically a kind of proxy for the number of people a given person corresponded with. And betweenness centrality is a measure that calculates how many short paths in a network pass through a given person. And so it's a useful way of showing that person's infrastructural importance in the flow of information in a communications network. And we've got their rankings. And the reason we compared these measures was we wanted to see if we could find people who had a significant kind of infrastructural or bridging function in a network, despite not having that many correspondents. What we can see here is that there's a general kind of diagonal trend, which you can see with that sort of red line. We've tried to sort of sketch it, that the more people you write to, the more likely you are to have short paths going through you. And the extreme of that pattern on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, right down at the bottom, is Francis Walsingham, who is Elizabeth's Secretary of State. And his degree is around 1100 for the 1580s, and he ranks top for betweenness. And so far, so obvious. The opposite extreme is that big splash of black names at the very top left, and those are all the people who have a degree of 1, so they only write to one person, and they have 0 short paths going through them. But what we were interested in were the outliers. So if we look at the outliers on this graph, I started to notice something. So Anthony Standen, he's a spy. Thomas Morgan is a Catholic conspirator. Gilbert Gifford is a double agent working for the government and also Catholic conspirators. Charles Paget was a Catholic conspirator. Bernardino de Mendoza was Philip II's ambassador and a conspirator. Francis Englefield, Catholic conspirator. Andrea Deleu, Flemish merchant and spy. And I started to think, there's clearly a pattern. Is this just an anomaly for the 1580s? But we looked at other decades and we found similar things. So we've got Charles Paget again, Thomas Phillips, who was a famous cryptographer and intelligence gatherer, John Snowdon, a Catholic double agent, William Allen, a Catholic conspirator, Christopher Parkins, right at the intersection of the two diagonal lines, he was a Catholic spy turned double agent turned diplomat. Crichton was a Catholic associated with leading conspiracy. It goes on. Henry St. Main, he's an interesting one. Oh, he's kind of like got a bit overwritten there, but he was basically a triple agent. We don't really know who he was. Was he working for the government? Was he working against the government? The evidence sort of was conflicting there. So when we look at the correspondence of each of these individuals, the reason that they have this combination of relatively low degree and high betweenness centrality becomes quite clear. Conspirators and intelligencers and spies tend to correspond with relatively few distinct people, but those communications bridge not only separate but actively opposed communities. And this observation started us thinking about, could we find similar kinds of people, based on their network profile? Can we find other people with a similar network profile? So we developed a method where we could take 8 network measures and put all of the people into 8-dimensional space and see who was closest to one another, to see, are they similar kinds of people? We wanted to see if similar kinds of writing behavior map to similar kinds of jobs or something like that. And it also helps us sort of narrow our exploration within this sort of search through 132,000 letters. So this is the kind of ranking interface we have for finding the most similar profile. You'll notice these sort of different shades of grey. So this is for Pietro. This is the most similar people to Pietro Bizzarri, who was a historian who was touring around Europe, but used his itinerant position to send intelligence back to the Tudor government. And you see he's got really low eigenvector centrality, which is black, but he's got quite high total strength, like the number of letters he sends. And if we look at the people who've got the most similar network profile to him, there are a whole bunch of people. So they include soldiers and merchants. But what we find is that most of them also occupy this role of sending information missives or intelligence back to the Tudor government. So they have that kind of that similar communication pattern maps to a similar kind of role served to the government. So these methods worked really well for our large data set from a single archive, well, a single kind of collection of data. But how can we scale that up? So I'm going to the third project now. So this is a project called Networking Archives, a newish AHRC funded project that I'm undertaking with a team in Oxford led by Howard Hodson. And the kind of premise of this project is the letter by design is a technology of dispersal. It gets information elsewhere, but it also has the unwanted side effect of putting letters into lots of different archives in lots of different places. And the kind of very effort of the traditional research projects like the collected correspondence of Erasmus or whoever is to try and reassemble all those scattered missives into one place. And the premise of a previous project run by the Oxford team called Early Modern Letters Online is, we can start taking those ego networks, the person's outgoing and incoming missives, and if we start overlapping them, we can start reconstructing communication networks. So we're interested in what happens when you start overlapping hundreds or thousands of these individual ego networks and bringing together archives like the state papers on which we've worked. So the aim of this project is to provide a kind of meta archive for early modern letter metadata. And when it's all reconciled, it'll be about 450,000 items. So it takes existing content from early modern letters online, the previous Oxford project I mentioned, the Tudor state papers data I've just been talking to you about, and a whole new set of state papers data from the following century. So from 1603 to 1714. And that's in the final stages of now being cleaned and reconciled with Emlo and the Tudor state papers into one big unified data set. And the aim of that project is to sort of develop and release a suite of tools for data cleaning, reconciliation, and analysis, to build capacity in the community in the use of network analysis through training, and to publish the outcomes of this research in articles, a co-authored book, and journal special issue. Now, the two data sets we're merging come from really different origins. So Early Modern Letters Online is a modern kind of meta archive, as it were, driven by the desire to try and study the Republic of Letters. So it includes key figures such as Samuel Hartlib, the 17th century intelligencer who saw himself as a hub for knowledge exchange, and many key Dutch intellectuals and politicians, including over 8,000 letters from the archive of the Dutch politician Johan de Witt. But despite its size, this dataset is still partial and therefore makes no claim to being representative in the global sense of the Republic of Letters or early modern communication. Many catalogues are incomplete. Hartlib's archive was rediscovered in the attic in the 20th century and had parts of it had been added to or removed over the years. Metadata has only been produced for 20% of Johann de Witt's correspondence. We have a really good representation of all the surviving letters of the Czech pedagogue Jan Comenius, and they've been meticulously catalogued and they're in our data set. But we know that most of his correspondence was destroyed during his lifetime when he got caught up in the 30 Years' War. By comparison, the state papers, it seems like it might be more fulsome because it is the sort of official state archive, but really it was just the working papers of the Secretary of State. And they often viewed those documents as their own private papers, and so they sometimes just got taken away with them, and some of them were admitted to the State Papers Archive later. And really importantly, we are viewing the communications of the government from the perspective of one key particular office holder. So it has its own kind of contingent factors, overlooked individuals. For example, that kind of very hub-focused view of the world can be described by this particular case of Joseph Williamson. So we have 170,000 letters for the Stuart State Papers, and 20,000 of those involve just one person, Joseph Williamson. So we began by comparing the makeup of these two data sets, one modern reconstruction of parts of the Republic of Letters and other the product of the State Papers Office. And what we've got here are just the degree distribution of both of those archives. So again, the degree is that sort of proxy for the unique number of correspondence of each person in that archive. And we can see they're really similar. We find that SPO and EMLO have a small number of highly connected nodes and a large number of poorly connected nodes. There's a sort of continuum of connectivity between these two extremes that renders them scale-free, meaning that at any scale, that pattern's going to look the same on a log-log scale. What are the reasons for that? So in the case of EMLO, this is mainly due to the nature of the size of the catalogues which make it up. EMLO is made up of over 100 constituent catalogues of varying sizes. 80% of the letters come from the top 23 catalogues, and with one exception, these catalogues prioritize one individual at the center, essentially sampling from the perspective of hubs. In this tree map, each catalogue is sized by its total number of letters. And this is mainly true of the state papers as well. A small number of figures are responsible for the vast majority of the volume of letters in the data. And one of the things that people say when they kind of encounter this, they say, well, you're clearly missing a lot of your data. And it's going to skew your results, and therefore quantitative approaches to this kind of data are pointless. So one of the things that we did early on this project is to start to think about whether we could quantitatively look at the effect of missing data. So this is a part of the project that's been led by Sebastian and Jan Ryan, and they've undertaken a targeted analysis of the impact of missing data on the outcome of network metrics. And this work's recently been accepted for publication in the Journal of Cultural Analytics. They designed an experiment which removed successively larger and larger samples of letters and compared the network metrics across the original and sampled data sets using Spearman's correlation as a measure of the similarity between each set of results. They ran the code 50 times for a range of standard metrics and for all the data sets we're using. And what they found was that all three data sets were surprisingly robust to letter removal, even with 60 to 70% of letters removed with most metrics. We think this is in part due to the shape of our data sets. So with a heavy skew towards a small number of nodes, and also because in many cases we have multiple letters between the same pair of people. So as long as one survives the sampling process, an edge will still be drawn between them. But it also suggests we should be much more cautious interpreting the results of the lowest connected nodes, those further down the rankings. They also tested some other potential sources of missing or incorrect data, including removing random samples of folios, so the large bound volumes in which correspondence is collected in the state papers, and random missing years. Some measurements showed more variability with certain types of removal. So for example, eigenvector centrality, which measures a node's centrality through its connections to other well-connected nodes, was somewhat more variable when we removed samples of full catalogues. This is probably in part due to the distribution of catalogue size, as shown in the tree map on a previous slide, Some sampling runs will knock out a lot of these really high-ranking nodes, resulting in more variation. And in some follow-up work that they're currently doing for the revised manuscript, they're aiming to model some common data curation errors and see how the rankings change as a result of incorrect reconciliation, so merging multiple spelling variants into one, or disambiguation, splitting a single name record into multiple people with the same name. In this way, we hope to understand the real-world effects of missing data, and by inference, the potential changes that would happen if additional data were to be unearthed or digitized. So one of the key aims of this project is to understand what kinds of insights emerge when you link collections and archives. To address this at the smallest scale, we developed a method for extracting ego networks that intersect and to show all of the correspondence that they have in common. So in this toy diagram, you can see an example of an intersection that we're particularly interested in, where two or more egos here, the red dots, don't directly correspond, but they have correspondence in common. These pink nodes thus form bridges that are important to understand. If we run this code on the whole of EMLO, which is a great test base because it's a set of unamassed ego networks, we can produce a ranked list of people with the most overlaps, and we can then delve into these, as in this screenshot, which shows the overlaps with Hugo Grotius and whether or not whether people wrote or not to one another. So we're interested in the people where it said, did they write to each other? False, they didn't write to each other, but they had all of these people in common. One example that we've been looking into, and Esther van der Ramsdonk and Howard Hodson have worked on this, is the overlaps between the Dutch humanist Gerardus Vossius and the intelligencer Samuel Hartlib, a person that corresponded extensively with people located in the United Provinces. For both men, the person with whom they share the most correspondence is each other. They share 20 people, but they do not write to one another. We wanted to understand why they're enmeshed. So in this diagram on the x-axis, we see the 20 people who exchange letters both with Vossius and Hartlib, and they've been ranked here by the percentage of letters they exchange with Hartlib and Vossius. And in this case, the people who corresponded primarily with Hartlib are on the left, and those who corresponded primarily with Vossius are on the right. And those who corresponded roughly equally are in the middle. And this is actually, again, on a log plot because of the volume of letters they can exchange varied so much. What it also shows is that the more voluminous correspondence exchanged numerous letters with only one of these figures. But the figures in the middle of the graph are kind of marginal to both communities. We're really interested in those sort of indirect contacts, these bridging figures, and we think there's a significance of them that might be worth exploring further. So we've developed another way of digging into this to understand those sort of bridging figures between different people's networks and what kind of infrastructural role they might have served, how they might have passed communications. So this kind of insight's been missing before because of the technical challenges of reconciling data across collections and archives. By connecting the sort of ego networks in EMLO and eventually with the state papers, we have been allowed to search for those who don't have their own archive, but whose centrality is defined by the position on the edges of multiple ego networks. To find these types of candidates, we looked at who could be found across many catalogues, but did not themselves have a catalogue. And they're highlighted here in grey and overlapped or shared at least one connection with many other individuals. The method highlighted figures such as John Dury near the top of the list, who is found across 9 separate catalogues and overlaps with 515 people, and Johannes Hevelius, the Polish astronomer and politician, who's found in 9 separate catalogues despite a very low degree score of just 36. So these people are the manifestation of the letters as a technology of dispersal. Only by making the effort to connect these collections can we begin to understand the significance of such individuals. So the final project I want to share with you today is concerned not just with connecting multiple collections of a single document type, but rather the kinds of historical innovation we can unlock by connecting multiple heterogeneous data types. Living with Machines is one of the largest humanities projects ever to be funded in the UK, so it comes with a great fun and a great burden. It grew out of a strategic partnership between the Alan Turing Institute, the National Institute for Data Science and AI, and the British Library. The contention was that the BL had spent a lot of money on digitizing its collections, and that Turing had the ability to help them harness with data-driven methods the potential of those collections. It's now a 23-person team with historians, data scientists, curators and library professionals, computational linguists and literary historians all working together. And what I'm going to share today is just the tip of the iceberg because of the amount of stuff that's going on. The general aims of this project are to understand the human, social and cultural consequences of the coming of the machine age in the long 19th century. And we're aiming to facilitate new historical findings about the effects of mechanization on the lives of ordinary people, to provide computational means of marshalling at scale the UK's growing number of digitized historical texts and documents, and to develop innovative computational models, tools, code and infrastructure that will be transferable to other research projects. And it's also a kind of experiment in a way of working, that we are a radical collaboration crossing multiple disciplines. So we are kind of humanists living with machines, and that's been an interesting intellectual process in its own right. So what are we working with and what are we doing? So to answer questions about how ordinary people's lives changed as a result of industrialization, the change of the workplace, the coming of rail and other infrastructure that changed communication and supply power, we need a whole range of different sources. A large proportion of our data sources come from pre-digitized resources held at the British Library, plus a small amount of digitization of their holdings that we've undertaken to harness opportunities we've identified when we've found data gaps and digital corpora we're very interested in. There's not enough time to go into details of all of the data sets, but this slide gives a sense of the volume and complex variety of sources we're using. So it includes textual data, such as the BL's newspaper holdings, visual data, such as the National Library of Scotland's Ordnance Survey maps, and tabular data, such as the integrated census microdata deposited with the UK Data Service. And so what are all these people doing with these digitized sources? So there's things we're doing with single sources and there's things we're doing across sources. And I'll just begin with the sort of more straightforward single data type work. So this is some of the language work. We are doing some natural language processing research on the project that we call dictionary expansion work, because we want to understand actually what was conceptualized as a machine at this time. It was actually a much more capacious term than we might think. It was used to talk about bathing huts and bicycles and prams. And so this piece of work is developing unsupervised and supervised computational models that automatically define machine terms. These employ the Oxford English Dictionary thesaurus to automatically detect mentions of machines in text. And the first task was to obtain senses and quotations relating to the lemma machine and use these as training data. So far, the team, led by Barbara McGillivray and Casper Beelen, have retrieved, I think, about 130,000 quotations for almost 17,000 different word senses, and they're now pruning that. And they're currently working to determine which senses are relevant, including whether to focus on mechanical objects and exclude figurative senses, and whether to include synonyms and hyponyms. Talking of figurative senses, there's a part of our work where we're interested in the use of the word machine to evoke a certain trope that of the, you might think of as a precursor to artificial intelligence, the machine with human attributes or animacy. So detecting animacy is a very common kind of activity in natural language processing. But what we found was that typical language models used for identifying animacy were very poor at detecting these instances of what we call atypical animacy, i.e. an inanimate object like a machine being assigned animacy. So the team, led by Mariona Cole-Adenauer and Daniel Wilson, developed an innovative method that was much more successful, which involved masking machine-related words in a sentence and asking the language model BERT to predict what that word was. And our assumption was that if it predicts things such as girl or man, boy or woman, that it implies the machine is being anthropomorphized. We developed this model on the British Library's Microsoft book corpus, which is 60,000 18th and 19th century books. And the method outlined in the paper at the bottom of the screen has been published, and we're now working on its application to write a kind of history piece to think about actually how can that method help us tell a history of the trope of the animate machine. Another key area of work is on maps, how we can read these map sheets at scale, noticing patterns across them. The maps team have developed a method for making new data derived from scanned maps that doesn't attempt to capture discrete map features. Instead, using computer vision, they produce geolocated data sets that classify tiles in a gridded map sheet. So in the workflow shown here, we are developing a data set to examine research questions about the arrival of rail in the British landscape. Beyond the simple tracking of railway lines as lines and stations as nodes, we're seeking to explore both the immediate visual context of rail space and to use the subset of rail space labeled map tiles to explore visually identifiable similarities in adjacent tiles. So rather than creating vector data for all rail lines and other infrastructure on 50,000 Ordnance Survey map sheets, this tiling and label prediction method requires only a few thousand annotations. So we're creating these human selected labels of tiles for training data. So a project that might have taken years can now happen in less than a week. In the UK, that's very significant because railway track vector data has been released only as snapshots of certain years, 1851, 61, 81. And our method allows for new information about the rail landscape from other years to be collected. So what can we do with this kind of information? This research is driven by a desire to know more about the landscape that rail created in tandem with other industrial activity. To generate some data about the landscape, we needed more than just vector data of tracks and stations. These elements have long been coveted by economic historians, but rail affects much more than those two kinds of structures. So how can we capture the way that the arrival of rail in a community fundamentally reshaped English, Welsh, and Scottish communities? So one thing we're interested to do is to be able to automatically compare abstract spatial relationships across the whole of Great Britain. So for example, there's this very classic 1969 study by John Kellett on the impact of rail on cities, and he observed something called the wedge. So when two rail lines are driven through an area in a kind of wedge shape, they tend to kind of kill off the space in between. So our contention is that we could say, computer, find me all the wedges, and now find me who lives there. And we could start to understand the kind of economic impact of those spatial organizations. So the important technical challenge there is that we need linked data to do that. And so this links to another part of work on the project. So we are seeking to link our very heterogeneous data sets through toponym labels. So one of the aims on the project is to tell rich histories of place through multi-layered data sets. The starting point for this linking work is a gazetteer that was developed on the project using Wikidata as its backbone. And this is now in the process of being enriched with a data set known as GB1900, which is the crowdsourced word labels from a particular series of the Ordnance Survey maps, and topographical dictionaries accessed from British History Online. And our aim is to further enrich it and link it to some of the long list of sources I presented to you earlier, including maps and census data and newspapers. So one of the technical challenges of matching toponyms both within and across data sets is the high degree of toponym variation in historical texts, including regional and diachronic spelling variation and mostly horrible OCR. So how can we make sure that we're achieving the correct place name? Our experiments show that pure string matching was not adequate. If you look at the variance of the place name Ashton_, on the left-hand side of the screen, which was extracted from Find My Past's newspapers, we could only match the red and orange spellings. So to address this problem, the team developed a method called dzmatch. It's a flexible deep neural network to fuzzy string matching, which was much better and had a much reduced computation cost. And we've had two publications accepted on this piece of work, one of them that's given at the bottom of the screen. And this is good. This is going to be a really key part to the toponym linking on the project, but it can also be adapted to all sorts of other tasks of matching strings. So it could be as useful for, I don't know, biological data, or thinking about trying to find plant names or something like that. It has really, really various uses. So from here, we're going to be experimenting with linking toponyms found in other context-rich sources, such as the topographical dictionaries, which have been provided us by British History Online, and newspaper press directories and trade directories. This is a great first step because all these sources are what we might call structured, non-geo-historical data. So the census would also fall into this category. A separate challenge is unstructured historical data, which includes newspapers and periodicals, and we'll get to that down the line, we hope. This work's still unfolding. We're looking forward to being able to share some new insights with you as they emerge. So just to bring this all together, what's next? So the Networking Archives project and Living with Machines is still ongoing, and there's going to be things forthcoming in the coming months and years. So we're releasing linked data sets, we're releasing our tools and pipelines for data cleaning and reconciliation, as well as infrastructure components. We're going to publish outcomes of the work enabled by such approaches. But there is a broader context in which these projects sit. So cultural heritage organizations know that they need to find ways of overcoming the data silos, both between and within individual institutions. But those individual institutions don't have the budget to fix this problem themselves. And single project solutions like ours are not the solution either if there's no uptake and there's no coordination. So national and international coordination are needed and dedicated funding. The onus is on us, I guess, to try and coordinate with these different national and international initiatives. And so there's things like the UK's Towards a National Collection, which is a great first set of steps towards that. But we also need to be petitioning our national funding councils for strategic investment so that we can start developing a blueprint for a robust and sustainable national collection cyber infrastructure. And I hope that the first steps to this will soon begin. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. This is great. Super inspiring, and I think excellent, not only in terms of results, what you presented, but also showing how this kind of multidisciplinary mixing of people can result to multiple results in multiple sides, which I think is sort of like also one of our key goals here in CUDAN. Even though we have the handicap and also luxury to not be bound in a particular topic and a particular data set. Yes, so I think there's lots of questions, I assume, from the audience. And so you can either use the chat to sort of like pre-register stuff there. The other thing would be to just raise your hand. So if you have a question right now, please just unmute yourself, which you should be able to do, and ask a question. Who wants to go first? Nikita.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ruth. It was a very interesting presentation. By the way, I apologize for the background noise that you might hear. I especially enjoy the parts when you were talking about the letters analysis. We've been doing something similar, but with emails in a corporate infrastructure. And obviously we faced quite a lot of challenges, privacy challenges, first of all. And we also had an idea to connect different ego graphs together to have some additional insights. But because of privacy issues, we basically ended up with an ability to analyze only ego graph itself. So do you think analyzing the ego graph in isolation might be also interesting in terms of some insights? And does it really have some potential perspective in historical scale? Thank you.
A good question. I mean, I think in historical circles, most of the work heretofore has been just with ego networks because of the inability to really link data at scale. So, I mean, you can chart sort of variations in incoming and outgoing correspondence over time and try and sort of pinpoint what might be driving those deviations. But I think our interest on the project is much more about like the flow of information. And so really you only have sort of input, you know, in and out, and then it sort of disappears. So I haven't worked a lot on that, but I know people like Julie Burkholtz has thought a lot more about it and the kinds of metrics that really work on ego networks. So her work might be useful to look at. I'll just type her name in. I think I'm getting it spelled right here. She had some really good suggestions about this to me when we were speaking about it. So I haven't thought about it enough, but
Mila, over.
Yeah, thank you. Really fascinating and breathtaking presentation. I would have so many questions, but I try to limit myself. Like first, this is maybe a very easy question, and I think that this is, well, my background is in cultural history, so I think this is something that usually historians using digital methods, people ask them often this question, but I want to ask it you too, because so kind of like I find it really fascinating the way you look at different all these kind of like correspondence networks and how you can reveal certain ways of or jobs or certain types of persons there, but and I think that it's also fascinating the way you kind of like layer and merge different data sets. But often like people not using digital methods ask, so what are you finding anything new by using these tools and these methods? And I get them myself too, but and I think that there are a lot of possibilities in using these methods. But how would you describe what kinds of new things you have found out by using these methods?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think it's one of those horribly unfair standards you get held to working with the digital methods, because if you're a historian working with analog approaches, people are really happy with you making an incremental addition to knowledge. And that's how we work. We kind of work at that incremental level where we're each adding on our forebears. But if you're working with digital methods, you have to completely find something that was never known before, completely transform knowledge. And I think that's problematic. So I think firstly, we need to sort of recalibrate the message about what we're trying to achieve here, because we are part of a system of knowledge creation that sort of does build. And I think often the first results in a project are, oh, look, we can now quantitatively verify that thing we were pretty sure we already knew. And we can just say it a little bit more precisely because we have a number to put to it to say, oh, we think the majority of people did X. And, you know, you could kind of amass enough examples by going through the archive in a traditional way to give a sense of that. But now we can kind of say, yes, the data bears this out. And I think often what you get then is you say, I'm seeing it verifying this and this and this, which we think we already knew, but we're seeing this one thing we didn't think we knew before. And so it's not sometimes not a huge thing, but it's something that is an incremental addition to knowledge, and it has that greater precision and verifiability. And we're kind of showing our working in a way that hasn't been done before in the humanities, that people could make all of these claims, and you just trusted their ability as a historian to have presented their data in the correct way. But there's so much hidden in the way that you construct historical narratives. And suddenly we're being held to the standard where we show everything to show that actually that narrative is true. And I'm not just hiding the bunch of examples from the archive that didn't really fit my thesis, but I don't have to tell you because of how we construct narratives. for me, I keep finding like small history, so small peculiar people who are outliers, or so I think digital methods are really good for quantitatively describing a phenomenon that people have sketchily described before, giving it precision, and finding really nice outliers, and also the ability to recenter people who may have been marginal. So that people like John Dury, he's been known at the edge of a particular history. But if we see someone like that stretched across multiple archives, and when we begin amassing their data, do we get a new perspective on them? So I think it's really good for prompting us to say, I think we need to recalibrate who are at the center of our narratives. So I feel like I tell a lot of stories of the periphery now, because that's where the data leads me.
That is an interesting thing, right? Isn't it? Because history traditionally also has this goal of going after the moyenne de ré, because it's sort of simple to sort of describe the individual events. In order to reach the audience, obviously you take an outlier because everybody knows what that is. So everybody wants to hear about World War II. Nobody wants to hear about who bought breakfast in 1873 on August 15. While on the other hand, the sort of like summary statistics, right? It's like, okay, so London is at the River Thames, something like that. There's about 3 million people in the core. So that is sort of something which standard traditional qualitative history can also do. But the moyenne de ré, like what happened, what are like sort of the more mesoscale patterns, that is hard in traditional scholarship, but it's also hard doing this in a quantitative way. And it's quite funny that one side uses, you know, that to like criticize the other, even though we're both like sort of probably the solution is to do both together, isn't it? So is there a kind of, do you see in this like large project with 23 people, I assume you have daily experience with that, do you see again a kind of subdivision where people group together? There's the language and the map people, and there's the quantitative and the qualitative people, or is there something new emerging that you know, where you can see, oh, there's a product that none of them would actually have produced 3 years ago, even something like that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I think that's true. That so I think there are points at which we are trying to publish to our home audiences something that they recognize. So there are, you know, because we want to validate the thing we're doing by speaking back to our home communities and saying, look, we're still able to speak to you, but we've been able to find something a bit new by working with these other people. But we're also trying to create something different that is that kind of convergence. But it takes a really long while to create that sense of what that product is, and even how you have the conversation, because the historians in our project were actually not digital historians before they started the project. So they've had to learn a little bit about how to code stuff and how to use Jupyter notebooks, and just to learn, you know, all these kind of words you think that other people know, but actually people in other disciplines don't even know the word, and you have to explain the very concept. So we've been designing a kind of a history book structured around a series of quantitative experiments that will kind of have a double output. That will kind of create a method that we'll publish as a methods paper, but also there's this kind of new historical outcome that comes from that experiment that each chapter is structured around. So in that, we're trying to create something really new. It's like it's going to be a 23-person authored book rather than a edited collection. So we're really trying to do it differently, but it does take a while to change what that product looks like and what that research process looks like. I don't know if that's the answer to your question. I think I sort of lost on a tangent there. You were saying something about mesoscales as well, which I thought was interesting, because I think that's where I'm finding some of the interest. So what's the easy thing to do is like quantitatively describe the whole, and it's really easy to find outliers. So essentially using a quantitative method to get back to the way that we did stuff before, because the little case study is a really easy thing to write. What I think is really interesting is that emergence of the mesoscale. So there's sort of localized patterns where you're saying, do you know what, I'm seeing this category of things that I wouldn't have put together before, and maybe now we can tell an aggregate history of this kind of person, because we wouldn't have seen them as a similar kind of person before, but now we can say these merchants and historians and soldiers are actually doing a really similar thing, and they're probably not that interesting as a bunch of single people, but when we understand them as an aggregate group, they become interesting. And I think that's where it gets interesting. And similarly with the map stuff, that kind of that kind of wedge approach, like, can we find all the wedges? We can start to tell an aggregate story there, where like you can, okay, well, let's reconstruct the whole rail infrastructure. That's one thing. And we can like find an interesting case study about where rail came at a specific moment and did a specific thing. But finding all of the wedges and what happened to the socio-economic climate in that area, that's I think that's where that sweet spot is, that kind of Mesa scale, but it gets really interesting.
Maybe
I think Andreas has a hand up.
Yes, Andreas. Yes, Andres.
Very nice talk. Thank you very much. So I had a question about very much about research. So you mentioned a number of things that sort of challenges that you overcome, and like messy metadata or missing data, and then how to quantify that missingness. And then in the end, you talked about like building infrastructure and forging networks and this sort of like things around the science. And you now also mentioned like other things like just training historians to use Python and whatnot. But here's my question: in your personal opinion, working with the sort of data that you do in these projects, what's the like current most burning sort of research challenge to solve right now? Like, what's the hardest question right now?
I think this is a really specifically UK problem, but I think other countries might have a similar problem. It's working between open and closed data. That we, our cultural heritage organisations have not been funded well to do digitization, but they've had to do it. So they've partnered with private companies, and that data, despite being our national holdings, has ended up behind a paywall. And so we have like this mixed economy of open data that has been funded by projects that have been able to put things openly available, and then we've got data behind paywalls that you can only access if you're a rich university, or if you come up with some complex legal agreement with that company. But you might want to like link these different data sets, and they're in these completely different environments, and you've got these different kind of legal constraints about what you can do with it. So that's hugely difficult. And then I don't think I don't have any answers. I'm spending time on my project documenting how hard that is, just so that others know how hard it's going to be before they attempt it. And we're sort of thinking about, so the Alan Turing Institute has like this way of classifying different data sets and how you should interact with them that keeps them the correct level of secure for the correct level of risk about sharing their data. And so stuff that has a kind of commercial origin has to be put in a certain work environment that's a bit restrictive. So we're thinking about different ways. Okay, how can we create alternate versions of that data so we can work more freely with it and share it? So I think that's useful in that we're kind of trying to square the circle, but it doesn't really solve the root problem, which is that there's not enough money and the nation's data is ending up behind a paywall. It's a really pragmatic answer. It's not really a research question per se, but it's getting in the way of research.
And what would be your, like, to reiterate the question, what would be your the most pressing research question where you would personally say, okay, if I could sort of with no constraints, like what would be the thing that would enthuse me the most to find out? Is it like just all the data and seeing the pattern, or would this be something where so this is something which is maybe I should send before as a premise. So we have this thing like which has partially to do how I sort of influence this, is we aim to go after phenomena. Yeah. And then the question is like, what kind of data do you need in order to actually sort of like make, you know, not having something that is biased in all directions, and so whatever you find out is messed up. But so the question is obviously, how do we sort of reconstruct dynamics in culture? What should we actually look at? That does not say we're not in for the big picture. We are in for the big picture, but what in the big picture should we actually analyze? Is it the same questions again, or should we have new questions?
I think so. For me, it's those figures who have been marginalized by national and local and just collection processes, right? That what people have thought are useful to collect. And so for me, the pragmatic thing to do is like link the data so that you can get at those people who have been put at the periphery. And so as long as we have like fragments of references to them and the ability to try and say that person is that same person as that one over there, we can start to find out who are the people who have been marginalized, but actually start to emerge as interesting when you have the ability to take those fragments and stick them back together. So yeah, that's what I'm really excited in, those sort of marginal histories and how that might allow us to recalibrate our histories that bring in more women, to bring in figures who might have been itinerant or have been written out of those narratives just for a variety of political and religious and gender-based reasons.
Yeah, that is I think very straight. Actually, that's sort of like how my sales pitch for your project is. Whenever I point to you, I say like they're gonna do the, you know, NASA women, but for all of history of computation. And I think that is a very striking thing, because there is actually a lot of marginalization, and even if it's just because of concentration in essence. So I have another question, because I see no hands raised so far, which has to do with the fact that on the one hand, you know, we have our own home audiences, but then there is audiences that don't exist. Like, you know, there's very few network scientists, physicists who would be interested in the degree distribution of letter networks. And sociologists have their share of them, so they may not listen. And historians, maybe they don't want to see that. And then you showed this one slide where you had like the IMDA and the
the state papers degree
and the state papers degree distributions that looked frappantly similar for somebody who has never seen such a plot. But if you have seen a number of those plots, one of them looked like this. The first data point was a little kinked here. It basically means that here 60% of the nodes are degree 1, and here only 30% of the nodes are degree 1, which is a factor of 2, which is a crazy number. So that seems like the IMDA data set actually has a much lower fraction of people that just send one letter. Is this due to the fact that one of the two data sets is incorrect, or is it due to the fact that some librarian somewhere decided, oh, if there's only one letter, I don't even document it. So these are the kind of things where how do we spread messages like this? Like, you know, I have similar plots. This happened to me. A physicist looked at it and told me this the first time, and ever since I look for stuff like that. But so the key question is, how do we actually get this into general knowledge within the community that actually relies on these methods? Because frankly speaking, it's not that hard. You don't need math. You don't, you know, it's just like a certain thing. You get a feeling for data sets by just learning how to read some basic plots. Is there any, you know, you haven't even talked about this right now. So there's a book that just came out called The Network Turn, which you wrote with Scott Weingart, Nicole Coleman, and also Sebastian Ahnert. There's a very small, tiny book. You can download it for free, but of course everybody should buy it. Which is a primer on network science for humanists and historians and so on. And so, can you speak a little bit about what are your experiences in trying to communicate and cross-fertilize these methods beyond just sort of assimilating them to your own kind of practice, which you obviously have, but there's probably now, which is moving the crevice sort of like to your colleagues, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, there's lots of linked questions there. So remind me if I'm missing something. So I think, firstly, the point on the graph, you're right that there is a slight difference. And I wonder if that's because the state papers, which doesn't have the kink, that's got a lot of petitions to the government in there. So just like one person, like one widow who says, my husband's land's been taken away from me. You know, so these sort of one-off. So I wonder if it tells us something about the making of those archives. So that might be that discussion, the fringe, like that fringe is twice as big, is actually really interesting. And so that's a story worth telling. You're right, like who are we teaching to read in this way? And so I think there's a number of things here. So I'm really keen in publishing in really traditional venues, even though it often takes double as long to get it into that venue, because I really want my home, you know, the people who have offices either side of me in, you know, back in the other world where we had offices, I want them to read it, right? So I often spend ages thinking about which history or literature journal will take this thing that's full of graphs and how do I then write it in a way that feels accessible to someone from those disciplines. So that's one of the strategies I've taken. So like raising the so what in the home discipline, so that you're creating a slightly larger community of people who are willing to engage with that, because they can see, actually, I can have a discussion about this, because actually that's a really easy concept once I get past the hard word for it. And then there's a kind of growing a community. So I think there's lots of people who are already really interested to do this, and especially people coming out of PhDs now or in PhDs and that early career, they're just more open to it because they've seen the possibility. So we've done a lot of stuff around doing training schools around people who are interested in doing it. So we put on like, we did a 2-week thing in the Folger that you spoke at, Max, and then on the Networking Archives project, we did a 3-part training school where we first of all helped, there were like 18 people, and we first got them how to structure data, how to use network analysis. Now what do you do with your results? Now let's workshop these things into articles. So we took them all the way through. So we're creating like a growing community of people. And then I think there's identifying your adjacent communities of people who actually were already sitting there and are ready to have that conversation. And I think there's a bunch of people around cultural heritage organizations and archival science who are just already there and ready to have the conversations. And they're thinking about it from a different way. They're trying to make that data ready for researchers to use. And you're the right kind of researcher because you're at that point where you want to have that conversation. So I think there's already a ready community there. And so it's like tapping into that. I don't think network scientists are interested in this stuff at the minute, but they might be. So Seb's developing some stuff that's a bit related to Suna's work. So he had like this idea about like some temporal analysis he could do on the work. So we're working on that at the moment, and there'll probably be like a history looking version of that work, and we're hoping there'd be like a scientific looking version of that work, right, where we actually focus on the method. So we're trying to raise the so what in the network science community next. I think.
Okay, nice. There's a question from Griffith Rees.
Hi, Griffith. Nice to see you.
Hey, sorry, my connection camera's a little rough. I could apologies if this doesn't go so well. But yes, that's me. Okay. First of all, it's really nice to see this presentation and the breadth of all of your work. It's astonishing how many things to bring together, and both obviously from a methodological perspective of linking in a literal sense the data from disparate sources, but how crucial they are, but also just the teams that are managing that infrastructure is to see literally the scale of how much data that involves is really impressive. I guess it was something that you were starting to refer to towards the end there, particularly on the dynamics of these systems. And that was something that was really important to some of my research, and I found very, very difficult. But like the one of the plots you showed in terms of these sort of centrality of these individuals, I'm guessing that's a specific point in time for those individuals. But if, for example, it was possible to then look at the time evolution of that centrality, especially as you have presumably records over the course of people's lives. I mean, even if you had an axis on literally the age of the individual and where that point in their lifespan, how that function evolves, and then, you know, if there are some, I guess, exogenous moments of controversy with that specific individual, and whether that increased the letter activity or significantly decreased the letter activity. That might be a really fascinating way, which some of the network science crowd from the hard sciencey background might also be particularly interested, I would think. I'm going to send you a link. I'm not sure if this is close enough to some of the stuff you're doing, but I think this dude is currently now in, Johan Koskinen is now in University of Melbourne, but he used to be part of the group up at the University of Manchester. And they, you may well be very aware of their work already. But I think they have been trying to at least bridge some of the qualitative and quantitative stuff. And I'm mentioning this one in particular because I think there's been a strong attempt to model missing elements in a network structure in criminology. And I think there's been quite a significant element to that for, I don't know, at least the past 5-10 years. And just in the off chance, as kind of been implied by some of the conversation already, different strands studying similar things, but not taking advantage of each other's work. I think that's one thing that might be worth having a peek at. And I'm blanking on their name, but the record matching project that you mentioned, there is a project with specifically on matching records for criminal science, which again might have some relevance. I can't remember the name of it right now. I had a really nice chat with the guy.
If you come across it, do send it. That would be really interesting to see, because I mean, these are the problems that are common across fields. And I'm part of a data science institute at Queen Mary, my university, and just speaking with medical humanities people and the problems they have of linking multiple data. I mean, it's the same problem, right? And actually, we just need to sometimes connect across problems rather than across topics, and that there aren't many mechanisms for that. How do you even get in the same space as those people? It just doesn't normally happen. So and you know, your lit review doesn't take you there unless you're in one of these weird cross-cutting organizations. So yeah, there needs to be much more facilitation of that, but those are great references. And
if it's helpful, I actually put in a grant application for improving matching records across network contexts. And I would have collaborated with a project called dedupe.io, which is based out of someone who used to be at the University of Chicago. I can send you a link to some of this stuff. And they've
very familiar, actually. I think they might have connected with some of my collaborators. Well, yeah, I've got the page here. Thanks.
Yeah, I can say the people that were very nice and very up for the collaboration, because you know, there's deduplication across a whole data set. And then what we were proposing was to take into account network and spatial information, because then that can reduce the set of potential matches significantly. And in my case, this was matching records which are contemporary from the Companies House and the Charities Commission. And there are so many duplicates of the same person listed on the Companies House and the Charities Commission. The classic example I like to bring up is I assume still current board of the National Theatre, which is registered as both a company and a charity. And it's almost certainly the same people, but their names are spelled slightly differently in both cases. One mentions one knighthood that didn't show up on the charity side, but it's almost certainly the same. You see what I mean? But yeah.
What's interesting about that is the interleaving of the research process, essentially the sort of the kind of metrics you use for research and the data preparation, and they are not kind of discrete moments in a research project, because you go in and you clean your data, you think you've got it pretty perfect, and then you go on and you do your analysis and you find these little things that crop up because you're throwing metrics at it that put people into a similar space, and suddenly you're like, I think actually that's an alias of this person, you know. So the research process makes you go back to the data again. So the more of that can be folded into the original data cleaning process, the better.
So, and I guess, sorry, the last thing, the crucial element of that in a network structure, because if you have, you know, if it's purely a, you know, like a logistic regression, you can hope that you've got enough respondents that are representative of the population, and that's fine. If you're missing a node in a network, you can have a very different structure and very different results. And anyway, end of my rant on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there's a link to what you just talked about. You mentioned this method that was developed in this project for string matching, deep learning fuzzy string matching, which obviously there's a kind of in and out going on. So on the one hand, this project or ensemble of projects takes methods that come from other areas, such as network science, or in this case, particular natural language processing. But in this particular instance, it also has produced something that goes that way, which obviously begs the question for the whole ecology of this. And obviously, you know, Ernst Gombrich famously said, art history is a hobby horse. Right, you're not as important as a medical doctor, but on the upside, you can't kill somebody. Which, given the kind of dynamics in social networks, is not true anymore. And so we have all these methods, we're going to use them. And in some sense, one could say history, historical data, social media data is some of the most complicated data. So we're going to solve problems that are going to be useful elsewhere. And so that is, I think, an interesting question, is like, what is the, is there and let me use this sort of like scary word, how about dual use? How is this benefiting society in essence? And how much do we also have to think about how is this endangering society? But because on the one hand, we reveal certain things, but on the other hand, obviously, the tools that are developed they're very powerful, and they can probably be used not too far away for things that the public should probably also be aware of. So how do you deal with this kind of thing? Is that something where you say, okay, no, we focus on the history so far, or is that something that is actually on the radar? Is this a discussion you have? How about the ethics of the whole thing, in essence?
Yeah, I've very usefully sidestepped it for a long while by dealing with really long dead people. And now I'm working on living machines. They're not so long dead. You know, the people at the end of our period, they could potentially, or they can still have family members that are still alive. So someone born in 1920 could just about still be alive. So we're at the edge of where it gets a bit grey, and so we've had to be a lot more cautious about what we do with the data at that end. And basically anything after 1878 or 1879, we're a lot more cautious about. But we are not thinking about the ethic. I mean, it's not part of the project at the moment, but it's something that's always at the back of my mind about how these things can be reused. Because on the one side, funding agencies are really pushing you to do things that will have that kind of general reuse. And we can kind of say we're like a kind of little lab in a way that you can kind of experiment on these things without coming into any of those ethical spaces in one sense. But knowing that if it can be pushed into another space, that it can be used in more ethically problematic ways, I think requires a lot more thought than we're giving it. So I'm just going to be honest, we're not thinking about it enough. But what I will say is that I think it's really important to have these really mixed teams developing such tooling, because I do think that we come at it from a different perspective. And because we are thinking about the humans, so I guess what's nice about the Living with Machines projects is we're looking at the shock of mechanization and the shock of what it does to people's lives, and the impacts that might, you know, the narrative in 19th century newspapers is, you know, you might be thrown out of your job because of the mechanization of this process, but in general it's like improving the lives of the nation, you know, this kind of very specific kind of narrative that we're hearing again now. So I think there are important ways in which we can look to the kind of history of this period as a kind of warning, to think about the positive and negative impacts. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but I do think teams need to be much more. I mean, we've got this kind of situation at the moment where the wrong people are being kicked out of Google, right? That and my argument is that data science institutes, they need more humanists in them. They need to be involved in the design of tooling. They need to be thinking about the applications. They need to be testing it on the kinds of data that we use in the humanities to see where it's failing. So I do think we're much more concerned with those failures because of our approach in the humanities that focuses on the specific and idiosyncratic rather than, and I think that comes to like the data cleaning thing that we had, why we took a kind of assisted manual approach on Tudor networks of power, right? Because a lot of our friends in data science were like, why are you not just completely automating this? It would probably be 90% right. And we're like, 90% right is not good enough. If we're publishing in history venues, we'll just like be laughed out of the room. And I think that kind of sensitivity to where, you know, good enough looks great for certain tasks, but where is it not doing what we need it to? And where is that actually stopping us from telling the important histories? So I think that's an important place we have to contribute. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sorry, so, that was a bit stream of consciousness because I was thinking on the go.
Which is okay. And so this is related. Obviously, in your project, you have this feedback load going on within the project, right? How about this issue of animacy? So there, you know, obviously, we've all seen not only are the wrong people kicked out of Google, but there is also now people who are at the head of other companies that run on machine learning. One of the Uber people has founded a religion where a non-yet existing artificial intelligence is already worshipped as God even before that comes to be. And one can easily see where this is going with, you know, basically robots that are ever better mimicking to look like humans or cute dogs that carry machine guns or not. And so the question is that something, do you expect your project to contribute something there? Because, for example, if it's always the same story that we tell people, no matter if it's, you know, some kind of steam weaving engine versus, you know, today, Sophie the robot. So do you already see some preliminary results where you could say, okay, there is a discussion, it's not going anywhere, it's always the same discussion, and we just need to sort of save society from it. So how about animacy? It's the short
Yeah, I think there are some important parallels. So I think what's interesting there is that there's an inverse trope that we started thinking about the animate machine. We were like, starting with the idea, you know, Turing's ideas, let's look for this particular trope. But and that's really interesting in and of itself, because it has all sorts of kind of repercussions for agency and you know, where you place blame. So, you know, where there's industrial accidents, where do we place blame? And it's so it's not just about human machines and that kind of science fiction. It's also about where do we place blame when something goes wrong? And so that's quite good. It's kind of got a legal kind of layer, but there is that counterpointed trope where we're not just spotting the machine that has human attributes, we're also spotting the human that's assigned with machine attributes. So that kind of mechanization of the person, how people become capital, as it were, they become like a cog in the machine, and how that kind of dehumanizes. And I guess we can think about, again, Uber probably as a model there for where people get turned into sort of this kind of these mechanistic qualities, but also where that has other ramifications that are problematic. So it intersects with the discourse of slavery in that period and enslaved people. So I think there's quite an important narrative that emerges there. Yeah, so we've got results coming out of that. We haven't turned it into a full narrative yet, but there's some really important things that have parallels with now, and I think that's going to be how we tell it as well. Okay,
thank you very much. Yes, so I sort of ran out of questions, I guess. Mila has a question. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I could continue with my questions if there are no others. So, yeah, I'm just kind of like curious if you could tell a little bit more about this Living with Machines project, and in general, well, because you told that you are, for instance, looking at language and how the concept of machines has been changing and how people have understood machines, and then you talked about this map kind of like approach. So I'm just kind of like curious, what so kind of like what other kinds of do you have certain like case studies within the project, and also so did you kind of pre-select these approaches when you started your work, or did these questions somehow arise from the data that you have been using? And I'm just kind of like interested in whether or not it's somehow possible, as kind of like you have this very interesting varied set of different kinds of data. So is it possible to somehow use this this kind of like varied data in order to kind of like fish new like research focuses or research approaches from there? Like, for instance, if you use like topic modeling into a text, there you, of course, like 90% is something that is already known, but 10% is something that reveals that it might reveal some interesting new research questions, and kind of like whether you have experienced kind of like using this more multiple or multi-phased data into for fishing certain kinds of like new research questions.
Thanks. Those are really good questions. So we started the project with we wanted to avoid having these sort of really siloed work packages where, you know, just the computational linguists worked on the text and the, you know, the spatial people worked on the, you know. So we started with labs that were very thematically organized. So we had one on language, the language of machines. We had like a space and time lab. We had like a sources lab that was interested in the bias, like how do we describe the contours of our data and understand its biases. We had sort of an infrastructural lab on like what kinds of systems do we need to facilitate the historical questions of the project. And then a crowdsourcing, sort of public engagement and crowdsourcing one. And we use those to sort of generate first outputs, because we had this idea, we were given this freedom that we didn't have to say exactly what we were going to do to the end of the project. We had this ability to sort of give them thematic things that we were going to explore. So we used that very much as a kind of coming up with proof of concept outputs. And then we used those to drive the foci of what was going to happen in the middle and end phases of the project. So what we weren't originally even planning to work with maps, but we got someone who was really experienced in spatial data. And so this became like, we started doing hack days around that, and it generated its own kind of part of work. So, and we made sure that in each lab group that we had this really kind of cross cutting set of people. So we had historians involved, we had computational linguists, we had data scientists, so that we would be thinking about each of these themes from a very multidimensional approach. And so I think what we're trying to do there is we're following these kind of strands of work that are kind of attached to specific text types. So there is a kind of relationship that, you know, the computer vision works with maps, and the you know, the language modeling is working with textual data, and we have an economic historian sort of leading the census work. But our aspiration has always been to kind of link across these and to design experiments that brings together at least two data kinds. So we're very interested where those things come together, so that, you know, where the map connects to the census data, where the things we're observing in the text connect to the map, and those kinds of things. So we're at that stage now that we're designing those sort of intersecting questions. So again, that involves these the bringing together of people with the different skill sets to come up with the method. And actually that's an interesting enough historical question, because it's contributing to that existing discourse. So is that kind of an answer? I mean, there's so many bits because it's 23 people and we have 1 million sources. And I think part of one of our problems is the absolute richness of what we're doing, that we could go on much longer and have many more people and go into any one of those things and throw out 1 million more things. So one of the key aims of the funding scheme that we got funded through was to spin out more projects. So we've already got our first project that spun out called Machines Reading Maps, that Katie McDonough is actually recruiting for right now if you have anyone with interest in spatial humanities. And that's about, how do we automatically extract text from historical maps to make them more searchable. So that's another point of the project, that we're throwing a lot of resource at very hard questions that we're not going to solve all of them, but we're hoping to spin out things. And again, the infrastructure component, dzmatch, I'm pulling it into the infrastructure of another grant I'm just drawing up. So it's meant to have that kind of generative quality, if that makes sense.
That is super interesting. I think there is so basically, is this spinning out, is that startups, or is it, does spinning out mean other projects that get funding in other areas?
At the moment, it's other projects, but I mean,
yeah.
I think the funding agency would like to see spin outs as well, but we're not in that place at the moment, or maybe the right people on the team aren't thinking about those things yet. But it's called the Strategic Priorities Fund, and so it was mostly funding other science projects. We were one of the only humanities project in that phase, and towards the National Collection was the next phase of that funding, because it's again sort of cross funding council that's not meant to fit within one funding council, because it needs that connection of people who are normally put into different pots for capturing grants.
Interesting. And so obviously this is part of the sustaining strategy of the whole initiative, in essence, right? As you said, you're quote unquote just a project, but so the question is, like, how does this roll out in the long term? Will this be the kind of in-house humanities DARPA of the Turing Institute, or can we imagine it like that? Or so will there be some sustained core of the whole thing, or do you think this is like,
unless we win money? No, because everything is about there being a kind of funding strand, right? Especially in places like the Turing Institute. So that's what I'm really trying to push, because I don't want us to be a flash in the pan that we're just there for 4.5 years and then there's no more humanities there. So that's why I'm really keen to make sure that we create groups, but also get more money, so that there is that presence, that there are humanities people in those spaces where they can affect change in positive ways. So we're not just creating tools that don't really meet the needs of all of society. So that's the problem, right? That the model is still that people aren't permanently funding these kinds of initiatives. So we need to make sure that it does something more. I think the one benefit is we're partnered with the British Library, so they're really keen for us to sort of deposit all our data with them, all that, and they're thinking about how they can change the ways that they do things to make sure that other people can do projects like this more easily in the future. So I think that's an important avenue.
Very interesting. So there is no raised hands. So I would, we could call it a day.
Well, I have two questions. If
Anna, yes, else. Okay, go ahead.
So one was related to the Letters project, because you were speaking about different networks and people connecting. So I was wondering whether you also looked into the letters, like the topics, and whether that's possible at all. But I suppose the answer is yes, because your latest project sort of looks into like the machine aspect. And then the second question is maybe more of a personal question. I understood that you're more of a humanities person from your background, So do you have like recommendations or suggestions to a non-technical person like myself, like how to start with digital humanities?
Oh, good questions. So firstly, the text stuff. One of the things, we have done some kind of analysis of the descriptions of letters. So we don't have full transcriptions, and that is something we'd love to have. That would be amazing. They don't exist at the moment, but we have these kind of synopses of the contents. And we've done stuff on, okay, can we see which topics change most radically over time? Can we extract those to see how that topic was being discussed across the community? And we can also find words with similar kind of profiles over time and see, and I think the ones with the most similar profiles often are about the same topics. We've developed a method around finding topics and texts. One of the things we're doing at the moment is understanding using a combination of topics from text and network metrics to think about how we can approach the idea of community from two directions. So people often do stuff around community detection algorithm, just using the topology of the network. And there's also kind of, you know, methods around like topic modeling and stuff to think about communities of discourse. And we're sort of trying to overlay those to understand how you might combine them to say something a bit more sophisticated about communities of discourse. So one was a little case study on the Royal Society, and there was like a disagreement in the group. So we're kind of using the combination of the two to explore that case study a bit further. But we're hoping that will be generalizable in some interesting ways. And as for advice, I mean, my career was just a big accident, really. Just there was no strategy. I was a very traditional literary historian. I like reading about other things. I'm married to a network scientist. We got really excited about working on this thing together, and we did one thing and then we decided to do another thing, and then other people thought it was cool and we ended up collaborating with them. And my coding skills aren't anywhere near as good as they should be because this wasn't a plan. So I've had to just get up to speed as I go along. But if I could go back to grad school me and know that this is what I was going to do, I would have got more systematically trained in programming skills. But I just didn't know this was going to happen. So it has been a bit sort of ad hoc and just learning things from experience, really. So having more sense of where you're going with your career would be my advice, and getting the skills you need. But there's so many training opportunities, but it's about having the time to do the thing properly.
Would you sign the statement that it's never too late, which too late. Both of us are living proof?
And I think also just saying yes to opportunities, because I think, I don't know if my female qualities or whether it's just about my personality, that my instincts are with, I don't know if I'm qualified enough to do that thing yet. I want to do all of this preparation before I say yes to that thing. And then I just say, well, let's just say yes and we'll make it work if it happens. And so I think just saying yes and making it work if it happens is the way to do it. And you learn so much by the doing as well, by being around people and actually actively collaborating with them, sitting side by side or sitting together on Zoom and actually doing the things together. I think there's no replication, because it's something that you're interested in. It's a problem you want to solve rather than an abstract set of skills you might use at some point. Yeah, so sorry that's a bit
that is brilliant. I mean, that's exactly what these are issues people have, right? Like we always have the feeling, oh no, I need to prepare more for this and that before we do X, and then the opportunity is gone. So this is very important. Peter Tinitz raises his hand.
Hey, I wanted to add another voice to this discussion. Thank you for the fascinating talk and discussion. I'm really closely following the Living with Machines project, and it's a really nice opportunity to see what you can get out of these archive materials. And I wanted to come back to the point that you mentioned in your previous answer, that it's a real trouble closing the connecting the open and closed data and kind of this private part, public partnerships working with data and archives. And this is one place that I think that there might be another of these reusable outcomes. That I'm working with Estonian archives and libraries, and there's a lot of there's a lot of drive to make data open and try to give it to the people to make it accessible, but there is very little knowledge on how it should be done. I think it's really, there's a couple of experts that they may be speaking with, and they have their own opinions. I'm working with the library at the moment to help them open with data. I have some ideas, but it's very difficult to convince them on my own. I mean, they will listen, but it's just a couple of opinions. So when you're documenting this this mess of a journey in trying to connect these two archives, I think that's a really interesting thing that you could share with other archives who are maybe not yet in that mess. That this could be useful. This could be useful in preparing how you will digitize things, what kind of resources you will keep for yourself, what kind of resources you can allow the private company to keep, and so on. So I think I would be happy to see that in a short public version, if you will get there. And if you have any advice on how, so if we're collaborating with these archives, what they should do, what would you say?
Yeah, that's, I mean, working with the BL, I think that I can see their frustration of what they're able to share and why they've partnered with private organizations. I can see pragmatically. I don't know. I think institutions need to kind of negotiate really cleverly about how long. So I think just making sure that there's a tenure, there's like a period that maybe they get to have that exclusivity, but that it will come back to the public domain thereafter. I think that would be smart to put those kind of riders in so that they get some kind of exclusivity for a short time. I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of additional problems where you might partner with a great private company who gives you really good terms. And I know of a case where they then got bought up by another organization, then it became a very acrimonious legal situation. These are big cultural heritage organizations. So yeah, I think they just need to negotiate really hard, but I wonder if they need to be sharing that knowledge about how to negotiate across institutions. And we're gonna write, we're writing we're calling it our handbook at the moment, but just basically all the hard stuff we've learned, we're putting in this book thing that we want to have open access. So at some point it will have a name, and hopefully, I think a series of recommendations to like researchers and cultural heritage organizations. But I want to have a chapter in there that's aimed more at funding agencies and more strategic organizations to say, this is where you're going wrong, and this is what we maybe need to do. That's the aspiration of the volume. So hopefully in the next couple of years that will come out.
It's quite interesting. We have a similar kind of deliverable in our project, actually, which is a kind of policy guideline summary of the work principles we come up with or whatever. And so it would be interesting to have a conversation about, like, maybe we can align in naming this kind of
I'd
thing.
love that.
Yeah. And probably we could convince other people doing similar things, because there is a kind of, it's also interesting to have this coming out of public projects and not like, you know, the Getty Research Center saying you have to do like this and that because we have the better lawyers and more money to print the book nicely. And so, right, which is like what digital humanities did in the 1980s and 90s, right? So there is now a really good chance to actually put stuff together. And this is, I think, also like Peter said, I mean, this is happening in many, many places. And in some sense, again, it's a networking issue, right? Where right now, in particular, there's a kind of shift happening where on the cyber infrastructure side, right, where you digitize data, you put it into repositories, and obviously all the maps go here, all the archaeology digs go there, all the text files go there, all the PDFs go there. That is a kind of thing where we can sort of be more engineering and always the same, where it makes sense to have large consortia like Daraya and stuff like that. But then there is all the messy research, which maybe, you know, where there is less sort of like cookie cutter style, oh, we're going to do it the same way as these other 5 countries. But so the question is, how do we actually sort of, you know, sort of nurture that diversity and allow for documentation? Obviously, there all of a sudden it looks utterly like scientific journals, right? That's the reason why you have in biology things like Nature Scientific Data appearing all of a sudden, which talk exactly about these kind of problems. And the question is, where is our niche to do the same? That's a really big question, in particular, because all the data processing in humanities is traditionally done in libraries by people who are sort of, you know, more managers, less kind of idle fancy balloon figures that are in front of the museum or something.
I think that's really good. And I think you're right that we need to work out where those general principles hold, and where some countries don't have this problem. Like we had our advisory board meeting recently, and one of the people said, well, Wales doesn't have this problem because they've actually publicly funded their digitization. But still, I mean, the protocols of like how you store things and that kind of aggregation model or whatever, I think that's where we need to sort of have that international coordination. Yeah, I'd love to talk with you further about it, whether we could
yes.
peer review each other's outputs. Mila, yes, I think you had your hand up.
Probably. Yeah, I just wanted to continue what Peter said, that I used to work at this Oceanic Exchanges project, in which we used like several digitized newspaper collections from Europe and US and so on. So there, my colleagues Melody Bills and Emily Bell, I don't know if you know this.
The Atlas is one.
Yeah. So the Atlas of different kinds of like, you know, how to merge like different metadata. So, you know, in some cases, this could be useful. Of course, it was in this project, it was our aim was to really use kind of like and merge different databases, but the like merging the like metadata was really challenging. But I think that Melody and Emily and others did a very good job in that direction too.
It's such a good resource. Yeah, it's really great. And yeah, more of those things that just describe what we've got and how we can stick it together. Yeah, that's really good.
Okay. There's lots of stuff happening in the chat. So you want to copy this before we...
Yeah, I am. I'm just like sticking those into my other window.
Okay, so yes. Now we're really out of questions, I think. So thank you very much. This was great. It gave us a great insight into the what's going on at the Turing Institute, what's going on in the Living with Machines project and your previous work, which I think is a very important lesson to sort of like, you know, see what the on-ramp of a digital humanist is in essence. And this is by no means the end, I guess. So even though this is one of the most outstanding projects, and probably not only in the UK, the largest one, but also, you know, it's hard to find comparison. One of the interesting things about it, as we have seen, is that it is open-ended and there's so many things that could be done, right? So my kind of snarky pun on this is taking the mission statement of the Broad Institute and just like cross out biology and medicine and replace it with the word culture. That is sort of the life goal of where we're going. And, you know, this is like one of the closest ones that actually goes in that direction. And it's certainly something that becomes ever more necessary to actually look at, because otherwise we just retell old stories, right? And with machines, it's a particularly difficult one, right? Because there are so many people in there who were not only good for humanity, while other people who tried to be good for humanity and did a lot of interesting and worthwhile things are not mentioned whatsoever. So with that, I would like to sort of close the meeting and thank Ruth again, and everybody else. We see each other at the next Open Lab seminar, which is not quite clear when it happens. Thank you very much.